In 1917, Germany sent a secret telegram proposing that Mexico invade the United States. 2 months later, America declared war on Germany. But what if Wilson had chosen differently? What if he had looked at the blood-soaked trenches of Europe and simply said, "No, the world you know, the borders on your map, the governments that shaped your grandparents' lives, even the existence of nations like Iraq and Syria, all hinged on American troops reaching French soil." Imagine a 20th century where Hitler remained an unknown failed artist, where the Holocaust never happened, where Soviet communism collapsed in its infancy. This isn't fantasy. It was the future waiting just one presidential decision away. History pivots on moments so small we barely notice them. April 6, 1917 wasn't just another date, it was the day America unwittingly drafted the blueprint for the modern world. But Introduction. By spring 1917, Europe had been bleeding itself white for nearly 3 years. The Western Front resembled a vast open wound stretching from the English Channel to the Swiss border, a labyrinth of muddy trenches where millions had already perished in the hopes of advancing mere yards. Picture this. As Americans debated entering the conflict across the Atlantic, British and French forces at Arras and the Chemin des Dames were launching yet another desperate offensive. Soldiers who had enlisted with dreams of heroism now found themselves living in flooded dugouts, surrounded by rats and the constant smell of decomposition. What drove America to abandon its cherished neutrality? 3 critical threads pulled the nation toward war. First, Germany's decision to resume unrestricted submarine warfare in February 1917, a desperate gamble to starve Britain into submission before American forces could arrive. The sinking of American vessels like the Housatonic and Algonquin outraged the public, who saw these attacks as affronts to American sovereignty. Then came the Zimmermann telegram, perhaps history's most consequential diplomatic blunder, where Germany secretly proposed an alliance with Mexico against the United States. When British intelligence intercepted and revealed this message, it transformed American public opinion overnight. Less visible but equally powerful were the economic chains binding America to Allied success. By 1917, American banks had extended over $2.3 billion in loans to Britain and France, loans that might never be repaid if Germany emerged victorious. Wilson's decision to seek war authorization from Congress represented a fundamental pivot in American history, a rejection of the isolationist tradition established by Washington himself. The question we're exploring today is profound. What if America had maintained its distance from Europe's self-destruction? How might the tapestry of modern history have been rewoven if those 4.7 million American soldiers had remained on their farms and in their factories instead of sailing to European battlefields? The immediate alternate war outcome. To understand how the war might have ended without American intervention, we need to examine the precarious situation in early 1917. The Allied powers were approaching a breaking point that few histories fully acknowledge. Britain and France weren't just militarily exhausted, they were financially hemorrhaging. By April 1917, Britain was spending £7.4 million per day on the war effort. Their gold reserves, once thought inexhaustible, had dwindled to dangerous levels. J.P. Morgan, acting as financial agent for the Allies, warned that without American entry into the war, Britain faced imminent financial collapse within months. This wasn't merely an economic concern. It meant no more shells, no more rifles, no more of the industrial warfare that had kept Germany at bay. Imagine a bathtub with the drain open and the faucet running. The Allies were desperately trying to keep the water level up by pouring in resources, but without America turning on a second, more powerful faucet, that tub was destined to empty. The Russian Revolution in February 1917 further tilted the scales. By December, Russia would sign an armistice with Germany, allowing the transfer of nearly 50 German divisions to the Western Front. In our timeline, these reinforcements faced not just the exhausted French and British, but fresh American troops arriving at a rate of 10,000 per day by summer 1918. In this alternate history, Germany's spring offensive of 1918, Operation Michael, likely succeeds. Without the psychological boost of American entry and without the physical presence of American divisions, the Allies might well have broken. General Ludendorff's massive assault, which nearly reached Paris even in our timeline, could have shattered the fragile Allied lines. The war's conclusion would probably come not through total German victory, but through a negotiated peace heavily favoring German interests, something akin to Brest-Litovsk imposed on Western Europe. France would face harsh reparations, territory losses, and military restrictions that would effectively end its status as a great power. Britain would retain its navy and empire, but would be forced to acknowledge German continental supremacy. The world without American intervention wouldn't see Germany conquer Europe outright, but it would see a Europe where German economic, political, and military power stood unrivaled for generations to come. A different European power balance. With Germany emerging as the dominant power from a negotiated peace, Europe would have been fundamentally reshaped, not through the lens of Versailles, but through the vision of German imperial ambitions. Imagine a European map where German influence radiates outward like ripples in a pond. At its core would be what German planners called Mitteleuropa, a Central European economic union with Germany at its heart. This wasn't merely a theoretical concept. By 1917, German occupation authorities in Belgium, Poland, and the Baltic states were already implementing integration policies designed to bind these regions economically to Berlin. The German economy, already Europe's most dynamic before the war, would have avoided the crippling reparations and territorial losses that stunted its growth in our timeline. Instead, German industry would have had privileged access to resources from Ukraine's fertile black soil to Romania's oil fields. Consider that in our actual history, Germany's economy eventually rebounded in the mid-1920s, even with Versailles constraints. Without those constraints, its economic dominance would have been overwhelming. For France, the consequences would have been catastrophic. Having lost 1.4 million men only to face defeat, the psychological trauma would have been profound. French politics, already deeply divided before the war, would likely have descended into chaos with right-wing nationalists blaming socialists for undermining the war effort. Democracy itself might not have survived in a France forced to accept German economic domination and possibly territorial concessions in the East. Britain would have retained its empire and navy, but would face a continent united under German economic influence, like a shopkeeper watching a powerful new corporation open directly across the street. The Royal Navy, Britain's historical guarantee of security, would still command the seas, but increasingly, this would seem irrelevant in a world where economic power was becoming more important than colonial possessions. Most consequentially, the monarchical systems of Central and Eastern Europe would have survived. Kaiser Wilhelm II, Emperor Charles of Austria-Hungary, and the Ottoman Sultan would still sit on their thrones, anachronistic perhaps, but gradually evolving rather than collapsing overnight. Without the power vacuum created by their sudden disappearance, the radical ideologies that defined the 20th century might never have found fertile ground. No Versailles? No Hitler? The absence of the Treaty of Versailles would have removed the primary catalyst for Nazi Germany's rise, much like removing the spark that ignites a forest already filled with dry kindling. To understand this profound divergence, we need to examine how the specific conditions of post-war Germany created the perfect storm for extremism. In our actual history, the Versailles Treaty imposed crippling reparations, stripped Germany of 13% of its territory, and, perhaps most devastatingly, included the infamous war guilt clause that blamed Germany alone for the conflict. These punitive measures created both economic distress and profound national humiliation. The hyperinflation of 1923, when a loaf of bread cost billions of marks, wasn't just an economic crisis. It was a societal trauma that destroyed the middle class and shattered faith in democratic institutions. Now imagine a different trajectory. A Germany that emerges from World War I not defeated and humiliated, but essentially victorious. The Weimar Republic, that fragile democratic experiment, would never have existed. Instead, the German Empire would have continued, likely evolving gradually toward a more constitutional monarchy similar to Britain's. Kaiser Wilhelm II, for all his bombastic rhetoric, operated within an established governmental system with checks on his power. His government contained both conservative and progressive elements, the Social Democratic Party had become the largest party in the Reichstag by 1912. This system, while flawed, provided institutional stability that might have evolved rather than collapsed. Would anti-Semitism have disappeared? Certainly not. Imperial Germany harbored significant anti-Jewish sentiment, but there's a crucial distinction between the cultural anti-Semitism of Imperial Germany and the industrialized genocide of the Nazi regime. Without the chaotic power vacuum of Weimar, without the economic devastation of Versailles, without the stab-in-the-back myth that Hitler exploited, the conditions for the Holocaust would likely never have coalesced. Consider this sobering thought. 6 million Jews, along with millions of Roma, homosexuals, disabled people, and political opponents might have lived out their lives in a Europe that, while still imperfect, never descended into the darkest chapter of human history. The concentration camps, the gas chambers, the industrial-scale murder, all might have remained unimaginable horrors rather than historical realities. This isn't to suggest that Imperial Germany would have been a paradise, far from it, but the difference between an authoritarian monarchy gradually liberalizing and the totalitarian nightmare of Nazi Germany is the difference between a flawed society and a genocidal one. Global implications. America's non-intervention in World War I would have altered not just European history, but the entire global order of the 20th century. Imagine history as a grand river. America's entry into WW1 was the moment when the river dramatically changed course, carving an entirely new channel across the landscape of time. Without this pivotal moment, American development would have followed a markedly different trajectory. The massive industrial mobilization that transformed the U.S. economy during World War I would have been delayed or might have unfolded more gradually. More significantly, the psychological shift, America's self-conception as a global power with responsibilities beyond its shores, would have evolved much more slowly. This alternate America might have remained focused on its hemispheric interests, developing more as a regional power than a global one. The isolationist sentiment that was already strong before World War I would have solidified rather than being temporarily overcome. The constitutional and civil liberties restrictions implemented during wartime, like the Espionage and Sedition Acts, might never have established precedents for expanded executive power. Beyond America, the colonial world would have experienced a different path to independence. The principle of self-determination that Wilson championed at Versailles, however imperfectly implemented, planted seeds that eventually grew into independence movements across Africa and Asia. Without these ideals being formally articulated on the world stage, and without the weakening of European powers through two devastating wars, colonialism might have unwound more slowly and along different lines. Consider the Middle East as a case study. In our timeline, the arbitrary borders drawn by British and French officials after World War I created nations like Iraq and Syria that grouped together disparate ethnic and religious communities with little historical unity. The artificial state structures imposed by the Sykes-Picot Agreement laid the groundwork for a century of conflict. In our alternate history, the Ottoman Empire, while still in decline, would have maintained control over much of the region, potentially allowing for a more organic evolution of national identities. The most profound difference might have been in Russia. Without American intervention ensuring Allied victory, the Bolshevik regime might not have survived its tenuous early years. The Russian Civil War, which claimed millions of lives, could have ended differently without the pressure of war against Germany being lifted. Without a Soviet Union emerging as a global counterweight to Western power, the Cold War, which defined international relations for nearly half a century, might never have materialized. In East Asia, Japan's imperial ambitions might have focused more on creating a sphere of influence in a China that remained fragmented. Without America's emergence as a Pacific power following World War I, Japan's expansion might have proceeded without the eventual confrontation with the United States that led to Pearl Harbor. The absence of American intervention wouldn't have preserved the pre-war world. Change was inevitable, but it would have allowed for a more evolutionary rather than revolutionary transformation of the global order, with consequences that would ripple through every continent and every aspect of modern life. Conclusion: a nation focused inward, Its industries booming, but its influence on world affairs limited. Without the precedent of World War I, would the United States have intervened in World War II? Would it have built the global alliances that defined the 20th century? Or would it have remained a regional power, watching as Europe reshaped itself without American hands on the wheel? History is not a straight road. It is a vast, branching tree, where every decision, every war, every leader's choice sends ripples through time. The world we live in today, the nations that exist, the wars that were fought, the people who were born or never conceived, all stem from the path we happen to take. But what about the paths we never walked? Perhaps the greatest lesson of this thought experiment isn't just about what could have been, but about how fragile and unpredictable history truly is. If one decision, one telegram, one delayed entry into a war could have changed everything, what choices today are shaping the world a century from now? That's all for today. If you have enjoyed this video, do hit that like and subscribe button for more content like this.